I'm an assistant professor here at the school. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ragani today. He has a PhD in evaluation and measurement from the University of California, Berkeley. Also has an MS from NYU in statistics, and an MBA from the University of Pennsylvania. He's been doing evaluation work for over 20 years, published in major journals, including actually the American Journal of Public Health, and has been doing wonderful evaluation work through his firm located in the Berkeley area in California, Gargani and Company. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Gargani.
Well, good afternoon. That's a good response. I'm feeling good now. Because the next thing I'm going to tell you is that I define myself professionally as an evaluator, which means either everything to you or nothing at all. Because evaluation, as I like to describe it, is the largest profession that no one has ever heard of. It's huge, there are many of us, and what we do seems mysterious to most of the world. What I'm going to talk to you about today comes from that perspective, which may be different from yours. Though I'd be curious, how many people here would consider themselves to be evaluators? Raise your hand. Oh, I've got a bunch of them. How many would consider themselves exclusively to be evaluators? No one. Okay. Yes. So for me, my community are the people who define themselves that way principally or solely. And everybody does a little bit of evaluation, especially in public health. That, understanding whether or not we're being effective, whether we're creating change is important. So my perspective may be a little different, and if you're an economist, you may think that my perspective is much different. So I'm going to leave some time at the end of all of this for you to ask questions and to straighten me out. So Mother Teresa and Ebenezer Scrooge walk into a bar. But it's not any bar. This is a social enterprise. The purpose of this bar is to make money, to have a sustainable business model. But it's also to train people who are unemployed so they can move on from working in this bar to other restaurants and bars in the area to give them training in food services types of skills. Well, Teresa looks around and she sees all the activity that's taking place. She sees people being trained, she sees lives being transformed, and she looks at Ebenezer and says, this place is of tremendous value. And Ebenezer looks around and he sees all the activity. He sees the money changing hands. He sees the till opening and closing, opening and closing. And he looks at Teresa and he says, yes, this place is of tremendous value. And they spend the rest of the evening talking to each other about this wonderful place that they're in and the value it brings. Two things to take away from that little story. The first is they are not really understanding each other when they speak. They're using the same words, but they're not understanding. And the second is, as ridiculous as this may seem as a premise, this is very much what you hear when people talk about the origin story of their social enterprise, about these two different sides of the equation around making money and doing good, coming together in some way that was unexpected. I want to talk to you about both of those, and I want to do it in a way where I bring what I call professional skepticism to this notion of bringing these two halves together, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Some of what I'm going to talk to you about today is in a paper that I published not too long ago in Evaluation and Program Planning. I would very much like you to read that paper. So I've given you this wonderful way of trying to find it. You could instantly get it if you want through the magic of your cell phone or other devices. If you don't have that magic or you don't know how to use that magic, you can just email this email address, and it will magically appear in your inbox through another form of magic. So let me start off by talking a little bit about markets. And if I were an economist, I would have lots of charts and graphs to show you, filled with information from which you could learn. But I'm not going to use that approach. Instead, I'm going to take you on a tour of the Museum of Great Ideas. And in that museum, there is a special wing dedicated to Adam Smith. And throughout the ages, people have come to understand what Adam Smith had to say. And this has made the work that Smith and people following him more and more important, and entrenched in the modern era an idea that promoting self-interest advances the common good. There is some truth to that, but it is the belief that is promoted in this wing of the museum. Recently, some people have visited the museum, and they're taking a different perspective. They're coming from a different place. They're not looking like the traditional people who were visiting the museum to begin with. And they're looking at this message, promoting self-interest advances the common good, and rearranging it to promoting the common good advances self-interest. This is a claim. This is a belief. This is a reason for people to take action in the world in new ways. It's attracting a great deal of attention. And it's even attracting attention from the people who have been visiting the museum for years and seeing something else in the material that was there. How much faith should we put into that claim? How much does it direct our work, or should it? Where are the opportunities for us as people trying to create change and as evaluators and researchers? These questions occupy my mind. I find this extremely exciting and invigorating. I see this as something that could be new and different. Maybe it is and maybe it isn't. Underlying is a belief about markets that what affects individuals is not necessarily all the things that we do to try to affect them, but it's their day-to-day life in a market. And this has led many people to believe that markets are the solution to problems that we see in society. Inequality, pollution, health, that there's a market solution to these. At the same time, there's a realization that markets are the problem, or at least part of it. Inequality is there because of how markets function. There's pollution because of how markets work. So this tension between markets being the problem and the solution is also another wonderful aspect of this domain which is emerging. How do we bring these two things together? How do we emphasize the solution and minimize the problem? So in parts of the entrepreneurial world, the investing world, even the world of philanthropy and government, where you hear terms like social impact, impact measurement, and impact management, they're the ones who are wrestling with that dilemma between, or that tension between markets being a problem and being a solution. What's emerged from that, some people are calling a new paradigm. Others see it as a small change. Some don't think it's a change at all. So I want to talk a little bit about what that change looks like and why I think it might, in fact, be a change. And this is a difficult topic to talk about because it's hard to put boundaries on. And I'm going to try to put some boundaries on it now, at least for our discussion here. But as soon as you put boundaries on it, you realize you can make them bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it seems to entail every aspect of trying to make the world a better place that we've always been involved in. Where you make it extremely narrow, that it only is fitting a very small number of organizations, and it seems to be missing a lot of what's taking place. So one way to put boundaries around it is around something called hybridization. And I first ran across this term in a Stanford Social Innovation Review article that came out in 2012, Julie Batlana and others talking about hybridization. Since then, in 6 years, so much has changed that I think while the premise that they offered is sound, I've begun to think about it much, much differently. In the old world, we had for-profit organizations, and they were interested in financial returns. They were Ebenezer Scrooge. And we had nonprofit organizations. They were interested in social impact. They were Mother Teresa. They were two different kinds of organizations. They never really mixed, except sometimes to try to get money from one or reputation from the other. But there's a realization that, Ebenezer Scrooge is in fact fictional and Mother Teresa is exceptional, and probably this isn't explaining the way the world works well, that the purposes organizations have fall on a continuum. And one of the ways in which we've seen hybridization is this moving towards the middle of for-profit organizations and non-profit organizations, adopting mindsets, methods, purposes of the other. The second way that we've seen this is through the legal structure of organizations themselves, which from the beginning are created to fit the middle of that spectrum. So we have a whole new class of legal structures for organizations that vary tremendously from state to state, that are set up in ways that have components of both a nonprofit and a for-profit. This creates new opportunity, we hope, a new platform for creating this change. This is oftentimes what's referred to as hybridization. Hybridization of purpose and hybridization of structure. But I think it goes beyond that to not just purposes and legal structures, but also mindsets and expectations and strategies and the markets themselves. And this is one of the problems in trying to define this new domain through hybridization, is as purposes and markets converge, then what emerges starts to look like commerce. If people value impact and they will spend more for it or seek your product out because you have it, then companies want to have it because that allows them to make money, whether they care about the impact or not. It looks like commerce. And you either believe that's good or that's bad. You might believe it's good because it harnesses the way markets work to create good. It is about taking self-interest and using that to promote the public good. Or you see it as bad because it's vulnerable to changes in how the market would function. That impact would be given up if something else were going to allow companies to make money. Understanding impact in these domains is incredibly complicated. And this is one of the reasons it excites me. I sometimes describe this as a three-part bridge where the methods we need have three spans, and the first span is about all the tools we bring from business and finance. And that span is largely built. And the second span comes from, I would say, the world of evaluation and people who are doing policy research. Those tools and methods are mostly there. But the third span hasn't been built yet. The third span is about methods we would use in this context that don't exist yet. Why do we need a third span? Well, imagine you're Tesla. Here's an organization that's huge. It's building electric cars. It's trying to make a lot of money from them. There is no requirement that it demonstrate what its impact is on society, on the environment, or anywhere else. No requirement whatsoever. Yet people buy this car in part because they believe in the impact it will have, because of how it aligns with their values, and because it allows them to, they think, make a contribution towards something that they care about. In this context, how could Tesla understand its impact? Should it engage in what's done in research domains, in public health in particular, where it starts out and does some small trials and moves up and continually increases the credibility of the evidence it has and does some large-scale RCTs and eventually maybe gets out to cost-effectiveness analysis? That would take a decade. And they're trying to turn a car out, say, a new model every year. What is good enough in this context? And one of the purposes here that are different from what we're used to is one of the purposes informing buyers about what's really happening with impact so that they can make choices and to make the markets more efficient in a way that lets them push companies to create real good rather than have the appearance of good. And if so, how would that look different from the research now, and what will we do? I think that's part of the third span. I don't know what we would do. There are other examples of this too. So the Aga Khan University Hospital is a nonprofit, but the way it operates is, and sustains itself is through a market mechanism of cross-subsidization. It charges people for services, but if you're wealthy, you pay a lot. If you have nothing, you pay nothing. Right? So this is another example of what falls within this domain of hybridization, using a market mechanism to make the delivery of services to a broader set of people more equitable. There's fair trade, which tries to use market mechanisms to generate a premium for products that are typically viewed as a commodity and have that money flow back to the people who are producing them and the people who are at the lowest level of society producing them so that they can improve their lives. Or in the finance side, there's the Calvert Impact Capital, which has something they call a community investment note, where you can put money into these notes. They will then find businesses in your community to invest in, businesses they think that will help create jobs and improve the quality of life for those around you. And they will bring that money back to you with a return. And they've been very successful at helping people make money that way and to promote communities. So these are just some examples of the richness and variety that we see from nonprofits to for-profits, operating all along the value chain from the beginning with financing, all through how products are sourced, to the sale and delivery of products at the end. This is another change for, at least my world of evaluation, where we've always thought of impact as something that happens at the end of a value chain through a product or service. We do all this work to make something happen, and then we deliver the product, we deliver the service, and that's where the impact comes from. What this change of hybridization is challenging us to do is to think about impact along the value chain. Regardless of whether you're nonprofit or for-profit, regardless of really what you think your main purpose is, you have impact along the value chain. What is that? How should you manage for that? How could you measure that? Again, we fill into that third span of the bridge, which isn't built yet. I don't know how we do that in a way that's timely and effective in that context. But there is a question in my mind about what hybrids can do and can't do. I suppose in the best of all worlds, the hybrids come together and make something new, a fierce beast that will create impact and protect our public interests. That might happen, or it may simply be the lion of commerce growing stronger on the bits and pieces of the trend and nothing really changing. What I sometimes refer to as institutionalizing what we hoped to change. I don't know. I'm not sure where we are on that. I suppose I should have a point of view, right? Because I came here to talk to you. Maybe one will emerge as I talk. So let's talk a little bit about the challenge of measuring impact and interpreting impact claims in this domain. The term measuring impact has emerged as a term of art here, and I don't think it's an accurate term. I think it's an example of what I refer to as short speak. We find short ways to communicate complicated ideas that end up making people think the ideas are simpler or different than they really are. In this case, when we measure impact, we're really interested in three things. We have to measure something. There's an attribution piece, and there's a valuing piece. We're not just describing what's different or how we've created change. We have to account for how different people view that change differently, as good or bad, how there are winners and losers. So there's three pieces of measurement, attribution, and valuing are what traditionally evaluators have always focused on. But again, the reason I'm excited about this trend is it's forced us to think about them in a new way and with greater rigor, and I greatly appreciate that. But it may be hard for researchers to really get on board with this. So I'm inviting you to adopt the Aloha spirit. And that is not a typo. I'm sure there will be many typos in my presentation. This is not one of them. But I would like you to adopt the Aloha spirit, where Aloha stands for the appropriate level of approximation. When we seek to understand impact in this domain, we are not seeking to do so with the greatest possible rigor all the time. We want to find an understanding of impact that is good enough for our purpose and no better. Because the more money and time we spend on understanding impact, to a degree we do not need to know for our purpose, we're wasting resources that could be spent in other areas, like understanding other impacts or trying to create other impacts. And in this particular domain, which has a strong private sector focus, it also means that you force owners to make a choice between earning less, charging more, and knowing more about what they're doing. And that's a difficult position to put people in. So this is not something that researchers get comfortable with quickly, at least in my experience. They have a hard time adopting the Aloha spirit. But after this talk, we will be going out, and there will be Mai Tais, and so maybe you will find yourself more able to adopt the Aloha spirit. So what does that really mean? I kind of chopped the world up into three sort of Goldilocks pieces. At one end, we have these attempts to study the world around us that have the features of systematic investigation, but in fact aren't. And we need to be cautious about this. It looks like we're doing something of rigor or meaning, when in fact we're not. And there's much of this taking place right now. But there are also people saying, well, let's take more sophisticated tools to this attempt to study the world around us. And at first glance, these would appear to be doing exactly what we want them to do. But it's important in this domain to recognize that, or it's important in this domain for those attempts to look at the world not to be too narrowly focused on what we thought we would create. Because if we're focusing on just the intended impacts, then we end up missing other things that happen around us that might be as important or more important. At least a laugh, finally. If you've noticed, there will be no content in this presentation. You are allowed to laugh. This is very important here because of the fact that organizations, and for-profit organizations in particular, are moving into markets they haven't worked in before, using innovative products. There's a chance for unintended or undesirable consequences to arise. If we focus all our attention on what we thought would happen, on our objectives, we miss that. The third thing we could do is just say, well, we're going to build in as much rigor as we can and look in every direction we possibly can. And I suppose if we had the time and money and the experience to do that, that would be fantastic. But this isn't sustainable. And it's certainly not sustainable for organizations that are privately held or even nonprofit organizations that are trying to ensure that they're financially in a sustainable position. So these attempts at understanding the world fall on a continuum. And there's a Goldilocks process of trying to figure out where we should be in the middle. A process that I don't think is easy for any of us to manage or navigate. So I teach a class on social impact measurement at Claremont Graduate University, and I've been trying to figure out how to boil down a few simple statements that would guide them, give them a start in making sense of this. And I want to share a couple of them with you because I think this is a fundamental problem of embracing the Aloha spirit. We can probably all of us build a continuum of methods we could use to understand impact, and I bet there'd be a fairly high degree of convergence on what that looks like. But I bet there'd be a lot of disagreement about where we should be on that continuum for any particular purpose. So I believe that requires us to be applying professional skepticism. And my rule to my students is always apply professional skepticism. And it's more than a rule. For me, this is becoming a social movement. I would like to take this to the streets if we can. I want professional skepticism, and I want it now, which I don't seem to be getting a lot of, to be honest. What is professional skepticism? It is not cynicism, and it is not skepticism. It is not accepting claims or accepting them only to the extent that they meet a professional standard of evidence. The problem with that definition is we have no professional standard of evidence in this area. So as professionals, we are the ones who have to determine what that standard of evidence is. And each one of us is responsible for doing that. So I'm putting a lot of responsibility on people's shoulders by saying that they should adopt professional skepticism. And I do not apologize for that. And to help my students with that, who, once they learn what I'm really asking them to do, are wondering if it's too late to drop the class, I like to explain to them that we're going to go through this in a much simpler way, a way for us to communicate. Do you guys have those commercials here? What's your sleep number? Do you get that? What's your sleep number? Yeah, okay. Well, I ask my students, what's your PS number? What's your professional skepticism number? On every claim that they're looking at, and they have to do a project as well, so we ask about that, I want them to be able to tell me what their PS number is. What is a PS number? Well, it ranges from -2 to 2, and it works something like this. PS0 means I don't know anything about this. I have no basis for judging it one way or the other. Everything you are looking at starts at PS0. As humans, we have emotional reactions to the evidence we see, to the efforts to make the world a better place. All of this hits us at the gut, and we suddenly start at someplace other than PS0 if we're not careful. I want students to start there. If you don't know, if you don't have a reason, you're there. You just don't know. If you're up at 2, then you know enough about the impact that you say it's worthy of action. And there are 2 components for me around that. One is you know that the change has happened in a way that enough people think is important that it warrants action. And the second is the quality of that evidence is sufficient that you would believe it, given the context and the circumstances you're in. You've got the same thing at the other side, which would be worthy of rejection. If you have 2 places in between, you could be worthy of consideration, right? You're kind of in between, you're not quite there. Then you got worthy of caution. So this is just a quick way that we can communicate with each other about where we are. A very slippery topic. What's your PS number? It's, I think, a learning experience when you do this to realize how frequently you have to claim that you are at PS0. As you navigate the world around you of organizations that you love and adore, and have to say that you are at PS0. I think that's awesome. I think that's fantastic. I think if we're not directed by our gut in expressing what we think we know about impact, we have made huge steps forward. That doesn't mean you don't support them. It doesn't mean if something's not worthy of action, it doesn't get supported on this scale. You have issues of urgency, you have issues of equity, you have issues of what's the alternative. You also have like how scarce are the resources and where else would they have gone. So being at someplace other than 2 or -2 doesn't mean that resources are left in this limbo where we can't make a decision. We oftentimes have to. But we know we're making a decision around a great deal of uncertainty. And that can direct our efforts to reduce that uncertainty in a way that gets us either to 2 or -2. And that I see as our objective. We want to get to 2 or -2, and we should be equally happy with either. Because if we can rule something out, we can put our time and effort into another area. Along with this comes another rule, which is justify everything. So those making impact claims must justify them. And by justification, it's not an argument as to why you're right. Justification includes qualification as well, just like we would do in science, right? We have to talk about both sides. Where are the limits? What do we know? What don't we know? And those interpreting impact claims also have to justify where they are on their PS scale, right? You can't just say, I'm a 2 because it feels like a 2. No, you have to provide justification. So we talk a lot about how to structure that in a systematic way. It turns out these are evaluative questions. And evaluation has answers to how to approach this systematically. We do that, for a living. So we can apply that here. At this point, I'm just trying to get anyone to even think that they should be applying professional skepticism within this domain. So if you think, okay, I can embrace the Aloha spirit, then I'd say my work here is done. Unfortunately, asking people to think hard about their impact and to justify it and to accept the reality that it might not be what they hoped for has earned me the nickname of the Grinch who stole impact. It's, I don't really mind the nickname, but it does miss the point. The point is not that I want to take away impact. It's not that I'm being cynical. Not that I'm asking others to be. But that we have a professional standard that we should be applying to this. And if we cannot identify what that professional standard is, the responsibility falls to the professional. And if we are not satisfied with that as a community, then we should come together and figure out how we can work together to devise a more common set of standards. As I said, researchers sometimes have a hard time with this Aloha spirit. I'm sort of a researcher too. I mean, I publish things that are research. I do research. But I want you to think about an example. I'm going to come back to this later in my talk. Imagine you have started an organization, and one of its purposes is to improve the health of people who are living in the global south, who are getting light by using something like this and burning it in their homes. And you want to replace that with a product that, let's say, looks something like this, which is solar powered, which will be clean burning, and will have a positive benefit on them, health-wise. How do you want to approach understanding the impact of what you're doing? You might say, well, I could get a grant, and I could spend 5 years looking at the research on this and developing randomized trials until I have enough certainty, and then I will go and implement this. But at the same time, getting air pollutants out of homes from kerosene-burning lamps seems like that's probably a pretty good idea. Would you want to wait? Is there a downside to getting these in? There may be. How much information would you need before you're ready to pull the trigger? And would that look like traditional research that you've done? If it doesn't look like traditional research that you've done, what would it look like? And as a homework assignment, I would challenge you to specifically describe what that would look like. Specifically, what would it take for you to decide to pull the trigger if this was your money invested in this, and how much of your money would you be willing to spend on it? I give homework. That can be easily ignored, just like my regular class. I'm going to talk a little bit about innovation and what that might mean here. I'm not sure if this is a different definition from innovation that may exist somewhere in the world, but it seems a little different to me. So markets create problems and solutions. When they create problems, it's because organizations can do something that they should not do. That's when we have a problem. How can we prevent organizations from doing something they should not do? Well, one solution traditionally has been regulation. Right? Now they cannot do what they should not do. Awesome. But that's a pretty difficult way to solve every problem, and not every problem is about preventing people from doing what they shouldn't. Maybe you should be trying to get them to do what they should. Well, here's where there's a glimmer of hope for me, where I start to move off of PS0 based on what I've observed in the world and the research I've done. More and more you see organizations doing this. They're deciding to do what they can and they should do, for a variety of reasons, some of them being driven by markets and some of them being driven by really a change in expectations of the people who work in and manage companies. People want to work in companies that aren't doing bad things. If you're doing bad things, they're going to leave and go somewhere else. They have expectations that you are going to operate within different bounds than they did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. And this has changed the way companies work, even if there isn't a strong market incentive for them to do that. Not all companies, not everywhere, but enough that this is, at least for me, very promising. But I get especially excited by this blank space over here. There's something we should do, but we cannot do it. Like, how do we make that work? And to me, that's the innovation that I'd like to focus on. Is how can I make it possible for something that we should do that is now impossible? How do I make that work? And some of it is technical. Some of it is around finding the solution. But some of it, too, is finding a reason to motivate organizations to do this, either through what's happening in a market, because they want to, because they have to. That part of the puzzle is a part of innovation that largely doesn't get considered, is how to convince people to use the innovation in a way that they should. And in this domain, when it is considered, it's around how do I sell more of my product, because selling more of my product means there must be more impact, therefore buy more of my product, which is, I guess, a great argument if you can support it, but a difficult one to view as universal. So I've done a very good job so far of really not providing any content. I will continue now by talking about metrics. And here, what I would like to do is to walk you through the evolution of a thought bubble. Here's a very nice young woman who works in a social enterprise / impact investing firm / nonprofit / organization that is some sort of hybrid. And she sits back one day and thinks, wow, we've done a lot. We help. That's the first thought that goes into her thought bubble. That's probably the thought that motivated her to want to join the company or start the company. And it starts with we help. And then she begins to realize, well, that's a bit vague. We help what? Society? Like that's sort of, no, we help people. We help people. She starts focusing on people. And then she gets a little pushback, and people say, really? Like, who are you helping? How? She responds, oh, well, we hope we help people. We hope we help people. That's why we do what we do. And then she gets a little pushback and says, you're doing all this on a hope? Like, this is a hope? How much have we invested in this? It's a hope? She says, well, look, we either help people or we do nothing for them. But they're never worse off. Well, that seems a hard position to support as well. So eventually there is a shift in thinking to move from here to we help people, do nothing for them, or harm them. The possibility enters her mind. And that changes how she has to view the work that she does. And of course, she talks to an evaluator, and we are very, very big on dividing the world into two pieces, the descriptive piece and the valuing piece. We're going to describe the change that takes place, and we're going to think about the value. So we change people, places, and things, and people have different points of view about who is helped and who is harmed by the changes. So you have the descriptive and the valuing piece there. But it goes on, because evaluators were kind of a pain in the butt, so we get her to believe that we have an approximate understanding of how we change people, places, and things, and people have different views about who was helped and harmed by the changes. And then we move on from there to we have a contestable understanding of how we change people, places, and things, and people have different views, sometimes based on the same understanding and sometimes not about who was helped and harmed by the changes. And finally, we have a contestable understanding of how we change people, places, and things, and people have different views, sometimes based on the same understanding and sometimes not, about who was helped and harmed by the changes, which raises questions about how we make decisions and share power. And so she brings us back to her board, and this is just like, this is impossible. The thought bubble has exploded, and no one can follow this. And the conclusion is that the way that they're running the company is perhaps, up for grabs. So they say, look, let's get back. What's our message? What's our basic message? Let's get PR and marketing in here. And they do is say, well, we help. That's our basic message. And let's make that the headline in our annual impact report. We help. Let's call it We Help. That's our impact report. And in it, we're going to have some metrics. They got to be easy to understand, and they need to just demonstrate that we help, like this, like 1,239,456 people were helped, with a graphic like this and only that many words. And this has become the standard for how metrics are being promoted. All that complexity that you as researchers build into your work, all that complexity that people like myself as an evaluator try to build into the work, doesn't fit into the space of an annual report or into the brain space of people who have so many other concerns as they're managing a company. This is a real challenge for us as to how to improve those. And I'm going to talk to you specifically, I think I have time, about some metrics and what might be good or bad about them. One problem with metrics around impact is that we have to actually understand what the impact is, right? That would be good, like some basis for that. And I think that probably means we have to talk somehow about the counterfactual. But there's a problem with that here, and this slide illustrates a problem that we have with the counterfactual in this domain. Can anybody identify what it is? You get extra credit. A homework assignment and extra credit in this particular talk. Can you find it? Can you find it? Did I spell it right? I think so. All right. It's the word the. We really have counterfactuals. There's an infinite number of counterfactuals. There's not one. And in this domain, that gets really important. You're Tesla. You have 3 models of cars that you can bring to market. There's not a counterfactual. They're the alternate cars you can have. The market you're working in changes. There are new competitors all the time. What is the counterfactual today? It's not the one tomorrow. And what are we looking at? Is it a world in which there is no Tesla or no electric cars? What if there's a technology better than electric cars? There's an infinite number of counterfactuals. There always has been. But in certain domains, we have a particular approach to this where we start oftentimes with efficacy, like can we make it work under good settings based like on nothing else or whatever the standard is out there now. And then we've got effectiveness, and then maybe we get up to cost effectiveness at some point. And that assumes that and we talk about the counterfactual in that domain. That doesn't work here. And so it's incredibly important when we talk about impact to define what the counterfactual is, because it has all the qualitative meaning of what impact is about in that. And yet, we don't. Another problem with metrics is, I have a long list of these, by the way, which I won't give you all. You're very relieved, I can tell immediately. But there's one I would like to talk to you about, is full coverage. I'd like a metric to have full coverage. And what do I mean by that? Well, full coverage is a lot like wearing a wide-brimmed hat. No matter where the sun is, you're covered, right? Awesome. Partial coverage is like wearing half a hat. Sometimes half a hat is all you need. Under the right settings, right circumstances, half a hat is awesome. And you saved money because you only bought half a hat. But if it's not what you need, well, you're liable to get burned. The same is true of impact measures. Let's think about impact as being on a continuum. Potential impact can go from minus infinity to infinity, which is how statisticians think about it. It's how I think about it. I know you can't have infinite impact, but just go with it. And you have 0 in the middle, which is no impact at all. Let's split potential impact into 2 pieces. You've got the true impact, that's really what's happening. And then you've got whatever you've measured. Right? You've got the measure there. Well, when your impact measure has full coverage, it looks something like this. Right? As the true impact swings across, or it could be anywhere in that particular range, the measure moves along with it. Now, probably not as perfectly as this animation shows. I lack the animation skills to show various levels of reliability. But the idea is the same, that no matter where the true impact may happen to be, the measure will help identify that it is there. Partial coverage looks something like this. It may still track the true impact, but over a more restricted range. In this case, it only ever shows that the impact is positive. And this is a feature of many metrics that are used right now in this domain. They don't have full coverage. Now, does that mean they're bad? No, it depends on your purpose. There are times when you can make this work. A statistician would say that this is a biased measure and you can do some things with that. Comparing it to another measure with the same level of bias, you might be able to learn something. But let me show you an example of one of these in the domain of these kerosene lamps. And there's a growing number of these solar or clean lantern alternatives that extend the day for people in various parts of the world, supposed to help them have more time to study and to work, cleans the air in their homes. But there's a tremendous variety of these things. There's tons of them. And it's hard to know which ones are better and worse. If you're making an investment in them, you'd like to have some comparative information. How do you do that? Well, there's an association, the Global Off-Grid Lighting Association, that has put together standards for metrics for impact in this domain that everyone can use and therefore are comparable. They did this through collaborating with quite a number of stakeholders. Their interests were both helping investors and the market grow, but also delivering impact. Again, they've got a little bit of Ebenezer Scrooge and Mother Teresa in what they're trying to do. One of their metrics is tons of carbon avoided. So I'm going to do a little algebra. It's very exciting. Hold on to your hats, or half a hat. So they start with S, which is the number of lanterns that you sold. You multiply that by the proportion of lanterns that you sell that actually end up in use. And they do that as 1 minus the number that doesn't get used. And then you've got this ratio, which is the number of kerosene lanterns replaced by a clean lantern. And then you have the metric tons of carbon produced by one kerosene lantern in 1 year. And then you have this number of years a clean lantern is used, which is comprised of 2 parts, which is W, which is the number of years that this is under warranty for your particular lantern, and M, which is a multiple. All right, so this is what they worked out through a great deal of consensus building, some research, all the rest. And the S and the W come from the manufacturer or producer of this lantern. They've got those numbers. They know how many they sold. They know what their warranty is. And all the others come from Gogla through this process that they've done. If you do a little algebra and look at the numbers, this comes out to be this: 0.54 times the number of lanterns sold times the years that it's under warranty. Well, under what conditions will this metric show an impact of 0 or less? You have to sell negative lanterns or warranty them for negative years, but you couldn't do both, because then we'd be positive again. So it's a quick way of getting an impact. It's very attractive if you're a producer, because you only need 2 numbers that come from you that you can readily get. It is accepted widely by the peers you're trying to speak to, but it concludes that selling more lanterns is always more impact. This is like wearing half a hat. And maybe half a hat is all you need. Maybe this is one of those cases. And I'd say that Google has done, in many ways, a very good job of explaining how they came up with the numbers and why they're using them. But I don't feel they've gone all the way in justifying why this will work and why half a hat is enough in this context. And as I said before, if you don't need half a hat, then, well, you're liable to get burned. Okay. I'd like to do a little checking with the powers that be about time. Where are we on time?
Depends on how much discussion you want. Using your parameters, they're always relative.
So I think my understanding is we're an hour in. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so we have a half hour left. As you have probably gathered, I could do about another 6 or 7 hours of this, but I'm going to suggest that I don't. I think at this point what I'd like to do is to open it up to questions from you. And I think you've sat long enough. I think an hour is more than any human should be asked to sit and listen to me, unless you're my children, in which case you have to sit for as long as I can.
Microphone?
Ah, here it is.
Usually delegated the first question just to break the ice.
The one parameter, I mean, thank you very much for a thought-stimulating presentation. The one parameter that you seem to have avoided very diplomatically is the one that does come up very frequently in conversations around the basic premise that you are evaluating, which is the ethical dilemma and the ethical frameworks. And especially when you're going to populations that may be more vulnerable in the sense that they are perhaps less informed and less empowered to be part of the process, then they can be easily manipulated, oppressed, and used towards ends that they have no control over. So I would like you perhaps to briefly touch on that domain because it's a significant one.
Yeah. Thank you for poking a giant hole in everything I just said. I appreciate that. I have tried to sort of dance around that while suggesting that it is an issue. The issue exists regardless of the kind of organization that is delivering a product or service or taking action in the community. Right? So I think that's a good place to start. I think it's reasonable to have greater concerns around organizations that are tied more tightly to a market. I think that is a reasonable concern. But it also gives us a mechanism of control because we can control the rules of a marketplace. We have policies and ways to do that. And I think that that is one way to exercise that control that you do not have in the nonprofit sector delivering services outside of a market. So that would be my first thought, is that we have mechanisms for dealing with it.
Remember, I'm talking about Dhaka, Bangladesh, and not New York.
Yes, I understand. But the position I'm taking is not to suggest that we should be transferring everything that we've done to market mechanisms to create change. Right? So I'm applying, as I said, professional skepticism to this. I'm saying I don't know whether this is better or worse until I have some evidence that I can look at. The claims at the moment about how markets will make things better is uneven and largely thin from my perspective and my look at that. It has a logical rationale that I think makes it worthy of understanding further and pursuing. The ethical concern is there, but we have had plenty of ethical violations that have come from international organizations, international NGOs, the UN, right? So this is not I guess what I want to differentiate is this is not a problem specific to organizations that are working in markets in some way. I don't have a perfect answer to how you address that, except to go back to the basic premise of how evaluation works, which is we describe things in the world, changes that we and others make, and we understand how people, a broad spectrum of people, are affected by them, value them or don't, are hurt or harmed. And if we continue to do that, we have a basis for creating control and monitoring and making sure that organizations act accordingly. But markets are essentially free and open, and people can do whatever they want in them unless they're restricted from doing them. So policy ends up being, I guess, one of the largest tools we have to make sure that they're operating in bounds, along with associations and others. But there's no perfect answer. But I think to step away from it and say, hey, I think this is like too risky, there are ethical problems here, could potentially be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We need to go into it with our eyes open, and we need to be willing to get the evidence that's necessary to understand whether this is an improvement or not.
I ask you to go back to your slide
should do and can do. Because I think you touched upon this, but
Okay.
my feeble brain is a little bit too complicated. So if we could go back to that one, and we could perhaps...
Imagine how I felt having to try to make the slide. Yeah.
I think you touched upon it, but maybe we could contemplate upon that.
I think it's coming on here.
Next question. You don't have to look at all.
Is this the one?
That's it.
Okay.
Should do, can do, cannot do, should not do.
Sure.
From me.
Yes, I'd be happy to. So I would say that markets and businesses, they're a source of problems, they're a source of solutions. They're both. When do they create problems? It's when they can do something they should not. Right? When they can do something they should not, then we're liable to see some problems. And the way that we've typically controlled that is through regulation and saying you cannot do this thing you should not do. And that has been effective to some degree in some areas. To my surprise, I have seen organizations decide to do what they should do and they can do, to change without any pressure on their own from the outside because they felt it was the right thing to do. I'd love to see this trend continue. I don't think it's a giant trend, but I think it's enough that it offers some hope. But there's a big area, the top left, of things we should do that we cannot do now. We don't know how, or we cannot get people to do them. And that's where innovation tries to find new ways, new solutions, new options within this context. That's.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. Companies like Disney should manage their value chain in a way to ensure that all of the companies licensing their products and making the products for them are not mistreating the people who work for them, that they're not hiring children, that there isn't slave labor, that the wages are reasonable, that the working conditions, right, all those things. But they really can't, because there's so many of them and it's so complicated and it's so expensive that there isn't a way for them to make that work. There are many companies now trying to develop systems, technological solutions that would allow them to do that and allow them to monitor that to a higher degree and to make that information public, which would make something that they cannot do but should, something they can do. So that's an example. Okay.
Hi. Staying on this slide, though, I think a larger methodological issue because the things don't fit together, in my opinion. If you go, for example, to you said that regulations don't really work well and they're not always successful. We can all agree on that. So that's under the should not do and cannot do, even though it really isn't effective in your own opinion.
Well, it's not a comprehensive solution. It's effective in some way.
I'm giving that. I'm granting
okay.
that. Then we put. I'll come here. Then you put next to that, which they aren't really related, regulation and problems, in a dialectical sense that most of these charts would be, if that's the proper word. So then you go should not do and can do. You have problems. But for the entities that don't like regulation, or that won't allow themselves to be regulated, which obviously is a universe because you yourself said that, they don't care about the problems if they can get away with them, which, for example, VW would be a great example.
Yeah.
As long as they're making profits and they can get away with it, they will continue to, even very illogically at some point. Or the Vietnam War is another example, not to use a product, because I have trouble mixing products and services and things like that. But we'll put that aside. Then go to the top, the should do and can do. Innovation solutions also don't have a kind of dialectical relationship or any kind of, you want an innovation to get to a solution, and I don't see how it's a should do and cannot do. And I'll leave it at there.
Well, it's a quadrilectic. Yeah, it's if you want to turn something that you cannot do into something you can do, one way to do that is innovation. Right? You can't do it now. You don't know how. It's not happening because you can't. So one of the things that innovation does is turn can't into can, which is, I think, a really great way to think about innovation. It's a very simple way, but I think it's a great way. And there's a lot that we should be doing that we cannot do. And that's where we need innovation. That's where social enterprise lives. That's where people who are trying to use technology, data, other aspects of the modern 21st century world to create a shift in how businesses operate, to have them do something they should, rather than having them do something they shouldn't. So that's what I'm trying to show there. And that regulation is a way of moving people or preventing companies from operating in this space where, they can do something but they shouldn't. So what I'm taking away from this is you don't like my slide. I got to change it.
Mixing together apples and oranges besides products with services.
Innovation service bundle out there, my friend.
Innovation is a fuzzy word, and innovation for things that we cannot envision is different from innovation that we cannot do because we don't have the knowledge. Like in AI, we're exploring, but in other things, we just can't picture it because we have, we're in our own, logical fallacy, our own bubble of thought. So we're just not able to see it. Mm-hmm. And you could go on with other reasons why we don't have a solution or another way of doing it. So innovation is too fuzzy and too dynamic and multidimensional to just call it one thing. That's another example.
Okay. I like simple. It helps me get things done.
Okay, can I?
Yes, I'm sorry, yes.
To try to bridge
There are
from
two
the whole
microphones, wow, okay.
To try to bridge from the whole innovation thing back to my question. I'm maybe giving away my age, but nothing used to be solar when I was a little kid. And some people remember when nothing was solar. So I wanted to take it back to where you were talking about the solar lanterns, and that looking at the benefit of the solar lanterns getting the carbon out of the air and out of the people's homes as being a good thing. And then I sort of almost felt there was an ominous kind of note to it where you said, okay, they thought that was a good thing, but they were only wearing half a hat, and then they didn't think about, and then you jumped to something else. And I was like, what's the bad thing that happened to the kids with the solar lanterns?
Well, it's not that I'm saying a bad thing happened, but they're using, there's a potential though. They're using a metric that, in a deterministic way, equates sales of lanterns with impact. The more you sell, the more impact you have, right? It's just do the algebra, right? And with a factor of 0.54 times your warranty years, right? So this is a deterministic metric of doing some good. It doesn't allow the possibility that you weren't effective in reducing the carbon that was in the air, or that in some way it made things worse, which is always a possibility. And the downside would be that you believe that you're improving the health.
How could it make it worse?
If you believe you're improving the air quality of people in their home because they're not burning these lanterns, yet they are. The air quality hasn't improved. Or there are other sources of pollutants like smoking or cook stoves or others that are contributing that your solution isn't enough to actually contribute to that health. You can draw a conclusion about the benefits you're having in terms of health that aren't really there. That might cause people to invest less in other solutions or to look elsewhere, to encourage others to use the same solution to solve the problem when it's not effective. Right? There's a possibility that you're drawing a conclusion that's not correct.
What would be a better way to measure that?
There are a lot of different ways to measure it. The question I'm raising with that is not to suggest that there is one best way. In fact, I don't believe there is a best way. If there were, we just would note what that is and I'll go do it. But that there is a responsibility on the part of the person who's measuring the impact to justify why they believe that is good enough for its purpose. And there's a responsibility on the part of the person interpreting that information to explain why they accept it or don't. Right, so this dual responsibility that at the moment in this domain is not typically carried out. You do not see people explaining their rationales for why they picked a measure except that it is the standard. And you don't see people explaining why they accept an impact measure except that it was presented to them, or it's a standard, or it was better than nothing. And so those aren't adequate justifications from my perspective.
I was waiting for the study that said that the kids' IQs were lower because they were staying up all night with their new electric lanterns, or they became slave laborers in a mine because the electric lights were so good, or something really atrocious.
But we have a lot of examples where this has been the case. So take microlending, for example, or clean water, which trying to bring clean water pumps into sub-Saharan Africa, even Tom's shoes, right, where claims were made over a long period of time about how the outputs of a process, like installing pumps or selling shoes, translated almost directly into impact in a deterministic way. And when more rigorous studies were done, they found that those claims were not supported, or supported only a little bit, or in some cases not at all. And with the case of Tom's shoes, they actually found a little bit of harm done to people who were selling shoes in local communities because a big container of shoes showed up and were given to people for free. So it's not that it's going to be the end of the world if you're wearing half a hat, but if you don't have a good reason for wearing half a hat, you introduce risk to other people. And I think that we should be a little more thoughtful than that. We should recognize that we're wearing half a hat. We should justify why half a hat is enough. I don't know, is that a controversial claim? Maybe it is. Where's my half a hat?
I was just going to say, I love this quadrant. I only think that the bottom line should actually be opposite, because if you can't do it and you should not do it, aren't you going to run into problems? But if you can do it and it should not be done, isn't that where the regulation should be required? Just my thought.
Okay, so nobody likes this slide. I think I'm going to move from this slide. Going to business school, one of the things you learned was there isn't a complicated question in the world that can't be explained by a 2x2 matrix. And I may have just found the counterexample to that. So thank you very much for that. That will help me. Other questions about a different slide? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Yeah.
Seems like is it on? Oh, it just seems like you're talking about a certain level of sustainable risk that you're dealing with. You develop a solution, but there's always a risk associated with it.
Of course, yes. And I would call that impact risk. And the impact risk is borne by the people who are supposed to be affected by this. You have to find an acceptable amount of impact risk. Almost all the tools we have in business are about assessing the risk to you as an investor or owner. They don't take into account the fact that the risk is on somebody else. Now, there are ways of doing that and techniques that could help you do it better, I believe, but they don't. They're slow. They're expensive. They involve spending time with people and understanding them, which is difficult for businesses to decide to do outside of marketing. Sorry, could you use your microphone again?
Sorry. What's the duration of time you're looking at? Like, what is the time increments when you start doing this type of assessments? Like, is it short term, long term, 50 years, 20 years, 40 years?
Yeah, I think that evaluation and research from the perspective of an organization that is one of these hybrid organizations it looks really different from how researchers and evaluators look at that. We tend to chop these up into studies that happen at particular points in time, and we're going to string together some meaning from that. But if you're inside these organizations, what you want is an ongoing effort to help you understand what you're doing. You're evaluating and doing research all the time through a variety of means. And if there are ways to systematically integrate that evaluation piece with the development of your product or service, or to think about how you can improve what you're doing along the value chain. So I would say that it's a different animal altogether, and it doesn't necessarily produce a study at the end. It produces information that people need in the moment to do the work that they're doing. How long? Forever, for as long as you're doing it.
Doesn't that kind of change? Like you have, say, so I was looking at the lantern, and when I was thinking back in my head, I was talking about that. Then when it burns out, then the disposal of issues, and then the plastic to produce it, and all the other stuff associated with manufacturing that's impacted maybe not at the local level, but at a larger scale.
Yeah.
And you always have to deal with that in terms of waste and everything else.
You do. And I think that that's why it's an ongoing effort. Because if you decided tomorrow that you were going to produce a lantern, it's a learning curve for you, right? As your first iteration through that lantern is, maybe kind of works okay, it was expensive to do, maybe it was kind of dirty to build. You make that better, you make it better. And each of the improvements you make through iteration allows you to solve more problems from first order to second order and so forth. But you can only do that, you only earn the right to improve by having a market that you can sell them in. This is different from research, right? You only earn the right to improve because somebody's willing to buy what you have already. And that's where we end up with this ethical issue, and this is where we end up with trying to compress the learning into the shortest period of time possible to reduce the impact risk on people who are affected by this. Yes?
Question. So going back to that report that you mentioned, that standardized the impact measurement of solar lanterns.
Yes.
Are there any qualitative measures that can be attained from the people who are being affected by this technology, and can you add it to that formula that maybe that could kind of account for some of these unintended consequences that you're mentioning?
Yeah. In the longer 4 to 5 hour version of my presentation, I like numbers, and I like words, and I like people. And I think words and numbers together do a pretty good job of describing people. And I don't think you can ever really understand people without words and numbers. And I never known anybody who uses numbers who doesn't use words too, because the numbers aren't enough. And I don't know anybody who uses words who doesn't also use numbers. So yes, absolutely. And I think that there are many qualitative ways to understand, whether people are finding more or less value, or having changes that are greater or less, or better or worse. They're just not as valued as much in this particular domain. I think that's a shortcoming of the domain. I think it has a lot to do with the people who are involved and the ways in which they were trained to begin with. Many of them in finance and accounting and elsewhere, where they see the numbers as being more expressive than maybe they are. But that's a part of that third span that hasn't really been invented. How do we connect it to humans in language and experiences that are more human, that allow us to see things that the numbers alone aren't going to represent?
Hello?
Hello?
I guess if you could comment on sort of the role of public health, right, as a discipline. Where do you see us in terms of this ongoing dialogue? I was particularly interested in sort of this standardization of evidence, sort of so that we can, it's very helpful to know that this dialogue is happening, but sort of how do we become stakeholders? How do we become part of that conversation? Any ways that you could talk about that?
Yeah, I think in public health and in similar domains, there's a fear that the intrusion of anything associated with the private sector represents a soft form of privatization of something that should remain public. That's actually what has happened in many countries. So this has been a tool for that, and there's reason to be worried about it. Much of this movement, I would argue, arose out of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. You saw it in countries like the UK that had very strong social contract. were finding it very difficult to meet that contract because of the economic challenges that they faced. So they wanted to move many aspects of what they were doing, especially around health, because that was expensive, off of government's books and into the private sector, and they developed a whole system for that, for private investment to support that, around something they called big society capital. And many people were worried about this. They looked at the UK is well known for its national health delivery. People there are very proud of it, even though it's got its many challenges. They saw this as a form of soft privatization, which in some sense it was. So I do think that it is worrisome in some contexts, and that people in public health should be a part of that conversation to ensure that, to help set the boundaries about what deserves to be public and what can be private and what can sit somewhere in between. It's a very hard conversation to have, and people aren't going to agree about where that is. But I think schools of public health, researchers in public health have a very important role to play to help policymakers understand that. Policymakers who change frequently, who may hold views that are hard for us to always to understand. There's a very important role for all of you in that conversation. But my little bit of advice, if I can offer it, and I'm hesitant to offer it because I'm not sure that I'm qualified to offer any of you advice, because you're much smarter and more talented than I am. But I would say approach this in the beginning at PS0. We may have a reaction to the private sector's involvement that's negative. We may have one that's positive. Start at 0 and work from the evidence and what you learn. There is maybe a possibility, a potential here for us to do something good for people. It's unprecedented that there's this many organizations striving to do something that looks good. This hasn't happened in the past. How do we encourage the good parts of that and make sure the bad parts don't happen with a better way of displaying that than my 2x2 graph? You can bring a better 2x2 graph and actual real knowledge and policy to this.
I was going to ask, how do you know when you're wearing only half a hat? And how do you know it's a hat you need and not an umbrella or something else? I mean, it seems like often, and that's the issue with a lot of research, you're only going to measure what you know to measure unless you have a way to elicit other things like that spaceship that flew by.
In my 8-hour version of this, I would talk to you about systematic models of impact. Right? We have concrete models of impact that we can apply. In this domain, with hybrid organizations, with this intersection with the private sector, impact is used all the time. Everyone's seeking it, but nobody can define it in any meaningful way. So I, being the person who I am, decided, well, I'll just define it. And I found that I couldn't because there were multiple competing definitions that are rigorous definitions. And that excited me even more. So the first thing in thinking about half a hat is, what do we mean by impact? And one of the models that I like to talk to my students about, I call it the DIA model. It comes from actually some stuff that was written in the 50s and 60s. But, I kind of stole it and changed it and gave it a different name, because that's what you do, right? And then the basic idea is that you have desirable impacts, you have intended impacts, you have anticipated impacts. And from this, you can build a set of domains that you're looking at. And largely what it does, by defining these different domains, somebody who is an impact manager, which is actually kind of a new idea. Organizations have people who manage the way organizations operate to create the impacts they want and avoid the ones they don't want. It lays out for them a roadmap for deciding which impacts are we going to approach in a confirmatory way, because we've anticipated them in advance, and which are we going to approach in an exploratory way, because we couldn't. And there's more than just two domains in this. And so within these organizations, I would say that a good impact manager is one who can decide how to allocate resources between confirmation and exploration, looking at both the positive and the negative, and having a justification for that. And that is how I think you see the spaceship, right? You have to find strategies for it. Some of that still exists in that third span. I'm not exactly sure how you do it. But I know that a better impact manager would be one who could figure that out or have a better strategy for it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gargani. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please, let's give a hand to Dr. Gargani.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really learned from your presentation. I'm not kidding you.